Good morning, everybody. I'm going to tell you guys about the time that our MBBR backed up and dumped all the media into the clarifiers. So MBBR stands for Moving Bed Bioreactor. What that is a big tank. So at the front of the plant, we had equalization basins, which were big tanks that all of the flow coming into the wastewater, it could fill these tanks up, and then we would pump out of those tanks to the MBBR. So the EQ was to equalize the flow so that we didn't have high flows and low flows. They'd fill the tanks up, and the tanks would fluctuate throughout the day, but we had a constant feed rate pulling out of the EQ tanks going to the MBBR. So the wastewater would come into the EQ tanks, and then it would go to the MBBR. Inside the MBBR, and the reason they call it a moving bed bioreactor is the bioreactor part is you've got bacteria in there, beneficial microorganisms that would consume the wastewater and start breaking it down. So inside this thing, you had media. And the media, there's a bunch of different types. They had some that look like little plastic wagon wheels. They had some that looks like a little spiky ball. The ones that we had, it was a little round disc. They were flat. They were maybe a 1/16 of an inch thick. Little black plastic disc with a grid on the surface, a raised grid on the surface of it. And then they were cupped slightly. Think kind of the shape of like a Pringles chip, but black plastic with a grid on. So the MBBR is full of these little chips. And at the bottom of the MBBR is an air header. You got two big blowers that are pushing air into this thing. And so as the air bubbles rise up through the water column, the little chips float around and move. The idea being that as they're moving throughout the water column, they've got the best opportunity to come in contact with the most food. And so the little microorganisms would colonize the chips in that little grid. They'd like stick to it and have little colonies. Think of like a reef, but a moving reef. So all of the little things, all the little microorganisms would stick to this thing. And as it would float through the water column, it give them the best opportunity to contact the food and thereby eat on it and help break it down. And so then after the MBBR, they would go into our aeration basins, which were just what it sounds like, a big pond with aerators, like a grid aeration system in the bottom that was pushing bubbles up to the top, putting oxygen into the water. You had different organisms in there, used the more highly oxygenated water to do their job and to eat on the wastewater and thereby clean it up. The last stage of the process after the aeration basins was the clarifiers. So everything would go into the clarifiers, and the clarifiers were real slow moving. The water came in at a kind of a trickle, and it would give the wastewater time to settle. So the sludge, which is what is the leftovers that the bugs, after they've eaten everything up and broken it down, and the bugs themselves and microorganisms themselves would settle out to the bottom into a sludge blanket, and the clear water would go to the top. Now, of course, the clear water goes out to our finishing lagoon, and the sludge gets returned to the front of the basin. That's why a typical wastewater plant's a return activated sludge system. So back to the point of the story. The MBBR, it's got all these little chips. We wanted to put a little bit of sludge into the MBBR because the microorganisms in there could help to strengthen the culture in the MBBR. So we're trying to return a little bit of sludge into the MBBR out of the aeration basins. On the MBBR, there's a check valve at the bottom that allowed water to go into the MBBR but not come back out. Well, because we had tied the RAS line in and we're putting a little bit of return activated sludge into the MBBR, when that check valve failed, it allowed not only water but media to backfeed, and it made it into our RAS room and into the RAS pumps, flowed through the RAS pumps and made it into the clarifiers. Oh, it was a nightmare. And so the process, this was an idea that came from corporate, and the idea was sound if the check valve hadn't failed. Because when we were putting the RAS into the MBBR, we were seeing like a 20% improvement in efficiency. So putting the RAS in there worked. Another cool thing about doing the RAS back into the MBBR is if the microbiology in the MBBR got hit real hard, we got like a heavy acid slug come in and killed off a lot of our biology, you could use the RAS going back in there would help to reseed that population and get started again. So, beneficial in a couple of ways, except for when that check valve failed. When that check valve failed, our lives became horrible pretty rapidly. We were using dip nets, dipping floating chips out of the clarifiers. We had to open up the RAS pumps, and literally just piles and piles of these little media chips were falling out into the floor. And of course, we're trying to scoop all of these up, and we got some chemical totes and cut the top off, and we're using them like bins, and yes, we like washed them and cleaned them all out good, but then we're taking all these little media, putting them in these bins to use a telehandler forklift and pick them up and put them back into the MBBR. We must have put, I don't know, 5 or 6 of those totes of media chips back into the MBBR. We wound up having to drop both the clarifiers because there were media chips all in the sludge blanket. We had to get vac trucks in there and vacuum all that stuff up, and then, get in there with squeegees and flat shovels and pick it all up. And it was just a profound mess. Of course, we got that check valve replaced because, we can't have it back feeding on the system. And even if we're not trying to push RAS into the line, I mean, if you ever turn off the system for maintenance, now your MBBR is trying to push backwards into the EQ tanks, which is not ideal. So step one, we had to get that valve pulled and replaced, and then we had to do a bunch of work to clean all those chips up and put them back into the MBBR. So goes to show what can happen when one of your parts fails in a hydraulic system. I mean, if a valve fails open, the water is going to move through that and back into the rest of the system. Well, guys, thank you for watching. God bless you. Have a good day. And remember, like and subscribe.